Welcome everyone to the Co-Creators Convergence Thursday night creator combos. I'm Noelle Marshall and I'm here with my beloved.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Bob Warner. Thank you so much for being with us this evening. Really looking forward to answering that question.
Yes, because that question, we had Sarbmeet on a call when Jennifer Morgan was with us. Yep. And that was my question. I said, well, what happened before the Big Bang?
That's how it started. That's how it started.
Thank you for coming to explain this.
Yes, so I'm going to be all ears. So welcome everyone who have never been here before. You're most welcome. We do this every Thursday night where we have a wonderful speaker and host. And I thank Viola Olsen for hosting tonight. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to play a very short video, minute and a half, that's going to tell you a little bit about our organization. So stand by. So welcome everyone to the Co-Creators Convergence. And I'm going to turn this over to our dear friend Viola Olsen, who we met through the Deep Time Network and has been a regular here also with the Co-Creators Convergence. And Viola also has a group that a very large group on Facebook that maybe she'll tell us a little bit about that before she introduces Sarbmeet Kanwal, who is our guest for tonight. So I'm going to turn it over to you two loving beings. I'm here to serve you. We're recording this. This will be available afterwards. And like Sarbmeet has asked, you can keep on your video on. And you can put during his presentation, you may put things into the chat and we'll pick those up when he invites us in for a conversation. So I'm so excited. So thank you everyone for coming, and over to you.
Well, I guess Sarbmeet doesn't need any introduction, right? I was going to introduce him, but a lot of you already know him. So a big thank you for being here to support and welcome. I have a short bio to read about him in case there's something in there that you guys didn't know, those of you who were here earlier. Okay. So first, Sarbmeet is an award-winning educator and a pioneer in novel ways of teaching quantum physics and astronomy. A novel way, that's interesting, really. He holds a PhD in theoretical physics from the California Institute of Technology. His aptitude for explaining intricate scientific concepts in everyday language has made him a sought-after speaker among both science and non-science communities. He recently gave a TEDx talk on our new origin story titled Chaos to Cosmos. Sarbmeet is a follower of the Sikh religion and a longtime board member of the Monmouth Center for World Religions and Ethical Thought, where he helped initiate several interfaith projects, including the co-founding of an award-winning youth leadership program called MOSAIC, which stands for mobilizing our students for action to build interfaith community. In the last 2 years, he has been assisting in the teaching of courses on the new cosmology offered by the Deep Time Network organization. In August of this year, he will be the sole instructor for a 4-week Deep Time course titled Quantum Wisdom, Essential Insights from a Revolutionary Science. And now to you, my friend, it's all yours.
Thank you. So first of all, can everyone hear me well? Yes? Yes? Okay, great. Thank you very much. All right. So as Jennifer said, the way that this talk got organized was that I was in another talk by Jennifer, and she was talking about the Big Bang Theory, the whole cosmic story. And then Noel asked her, well, what happened before the Big Bang? And I happened to be in there, and I said a few words, and before I knew it, I had gotten myself into giving a whole talk. So here I am. I am going to spend a few minutes in the beginning to help us center a little bit, right? One of the things that is good in my view is to get ourselves into the right frame of mind so that we can get as much from this as I guess we can. Okay. Get yourself into a comfortable, relaxed position, wherever you happen to be sitting. You don't need to close your eyes or anything. Just take a couple of deep breaths, releasing the air out in a gradual way, focusing on your breath. I know that all of you are coming into this session from many different locations and many different time zones. For some of you, it may be the end of a long, exhausting day. For others, it might be the beginning of a busy day lying ahead of you. Use your breathing, especially your outgoing breath, to let go of any of the tensions or anxieties that you might be experiencing right now. You can keep a nice peaceful image in your mind if you'd like, perhaps an image of a gentle, placid river with a deep, cool water, and you're floating effortlessly in it, letting the gentle current carry you with it. There's no need to fight the current because you've learned to trust the wisdom of the river. All right. So I'm assuming that you came to this session today looking for some answers to some of the questions that you might have. And you'll certainly get some answers today. I hope you do. If you've been thinking about these questions, you may already have some answers figured out as well, or heard about them from different places. So think about how attached are you to those answers. It's often the case that once we have an answer, we design our lives and our institutions around that answer in such a way that it becomes very painful to let go of those answers. Now, questions, on the other hand, are easily amenable to reframing them, rewriting them, sharpening them, and so on. And there's no ego tied to questions. So they provide motivation for us to keep seeking. So I want you to kind of see the difference between questions and answers. Questions have a lightness, a momentum to them, answers can weigh us down and have inertia associated with them. So questions can be like the wind in your sails, and answers can be like anchors that hold you back. So in the session today, I would like to shift your thinking into more of a questioning mode. Now, I'll certainly be answering a lot of questions, I hope, today. But I am hoping even more that through this presentation, you will have a couple of new questions to take home. Okay, and that really would be a measure of my success if I can do that. So just to get us into this frame of mind, I'm going to do a very quick exercise here. And you, if you want, you can participate. Otherwise, you could just be sitting there. And the exercise is this. Think of a question that's been with you for a while. And just put it in the chat box. Keep it short, just a line. It doesn't have to be a profound question like, who am I and where do I come from? I mean, if that is your question, that's fine as well. And it doesn't even have to be connected with today's session. Anything that comes to your mind as a question that you can share, I'd be monitoring the chat and just seeing what people say. So just put down something. This is just to get us into the right mood here. Did God, source, really create this world, or is it our collective illusion? Interesting. Is there a fundamental difference between human and machines? Interesting. What's for lunch? That's a good one. It's dinner time for us here. Okay. Let's see, any more questions from folks? Why does cold water quench our thirst faster than warm water? Ooh, that's a science question. I understand how physical body evolved, but can't understand how thinking evolved. How can science reconcile with consciousness? Wow. So I'm not promising to answer these questions, but it's certainly good to know that people have these very interesting, why does tribalism survive in the age of rationality? All right, I'm gonna, I guess, stop the exercise and share my screen so that we can move along. So here we go. All right, folks. So here's the question that we are starting with, what happened before the Big Bang? And as I could tell from some of the questions that you folks were asking, this question evokes both science and spirituality. And so my talk is going to touch on both of those aspects, and I'm hoping that I will be able to bring them together by the end of the talk. So in trying to answer this question, what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you two stories. And these two stories are intertwined with each other. One is a very long story, which is a story of our evolution over 14 billion years. And the other is a much shorter story, which spans about 100 years, which is the time frame during which we have made all the important discoveries that I'm going to be talking about today. And what you will see is that each of these stories lives inside the other. And I'll explain that later on, but that should become kind of clear as we go along. So let's start with the human story. And that human story starts with two questions. Like we said, questions, are the things that move us forward. And these are questions that have been with humankind for at least a few thousand years, right? And they're both questions of ultimacy. By that, I mean that we ultimately want to know what the universe is made of and how it works. And we also want to know where we ultimately come from, right? And so these two questions split up kind of interestingly very early on. One question deals with matter, which basically wants to know what everything is made up of. And so this question gets picked up by what we now call science. And the other question has to do with creating a universe pretty much out of nothing. So that question evokes miracles and spirit and non-matter. And that question was taken up by what we now call religion. And what happens in this story is that there is a deep distrust that develops between these two different approaches and these two different institutions. And a rigid wall starts to grow between them. And I'm sure you understand from your knowledge of history as to what has happened. Now, the interesting thing here is that science is supposed to be the institution that actually is open-ended and basically treats all answers as working hypotheses that are open to questioning. Yet, what we see when we read the history of science is that science also tends to develop a dogma. And we will see as we go what happens here. So this wall has been there, of course, for a long time. And the very first time that some chinks started to open in this wall was at the beginning of the 20th century. So that is when our story really starts 100 years ago. And it starts, of course, with Einstein, who showed that what everybody had been regarding as nothing up until then, which is emptiness, that's what we think about as nothing, is really not nothing at all. In fact, it's very much like matter. And then at the same time, a whole bunch of people developed what we call quantum theory, which basically ended up showing that what people had thought about was matter is not really like matter at all. And so this is the beginning of how things start to come together. All right, so let's go to Einstein first. And Einstein, along with everybody else in that space, had come to the conclusion, very dogmatically, no proof, nothing at all, that the universe was eternal. Part of it was because it wanted to oppose itself to religion, which believed in something quite different. And that's how dogmas really develop. So when Einstein put down his equations, and his equations showed him that space, which is emptiness, can't stay still, that it has to expand, he was rather startled. And he was also a little bit dismayed because expansion means that in the deep past, there was a point when everything was together, which meant an origin of our universe. And Einstein and most scientists at that point were not comfortable with that. So first of all, I want everyone to understand what expansion of space really means. A lot of you have heard about galaxies going apart from each other, but you have to be very careful to understand that expansion is not about motion. Expansion is about space. It's the expansion of space itself. And a good example that people give, which I think works very well, is to think about a raisin cake. If you put a raisin cake in the oven, the raisin cake expands and the raisins move away from each other, but they're not moving inside the batter of the cake. It's the batter of the cake that is making them go apart by simply becoming bigger. This is exactly what Einstein discovered was going on, was space itself was expanding. So what did Einstein do? The first thing that Einstein did was that he changed his equation. So he said, this is just not possible, feasible, and he manipulated his equation so that it would give him a static universe. But that didn't last very long. An astronomer by the name of Hubble, I'm sure you recognize his name well, he was able to show through his telescopes that galaxies were expanding away. And therefore, a few physicists started to converge to the point that maybe the universe is indeed expanding, and therefore it started as a small, hot universe in the beginning. The very first individual that put this idea out was actually an astrophysicist who was also a Catholic priest. His name was George Lemaitre. And instantly, physicists turned against him, including Einstein, who made this interesting statement where he said to George, your math is correct, but your physics is abominable. In fact, there's an interesting interplay that happens between science and religion right now, because when George comes up with his ideas, he's a Catholic priest, the Pope picks up on it, he gives a speech saying that the Big Bang has actually proven that there is an existence of God, that there is an origin. And interestingly, Lemaitre knew enough about physics that he immediately wrote a stern letter to the Pope asking him to stay out of this debate. It's not going to be a good one for anybody to be in. And that's, the Pope did actually listen to him. All right, so then, the opposition to these ideas was so strong that in the next 40 years, despite the fact that the evidence that there was expansion going on was growing, the scientific community kept coming up with other ways of explaining it away. In fact, it's interesting how the name Big Bang came to be. One of the leaders of the opposition to the Big Bang theory was a British physicist by the name of Fred Hoyle. And he used to give broadcasts on BBC. And in one of them, he was trying to make fun of these people who thought that the universe could possibly start with a bang. So he said, oh, those people that think that the universe started with a Big Bang. And of course, the name stuck. That's what we call the theory now. All right, so how did we figure out that the Big Bang is indeed the correct theory? Our confidence in the Big Bang theory is as strong as it can be in any theory whatsoever. So there is no question of that anymore. And I will tell you a little bit about how this confidence developed over time. The first thing that happened is people figured out that unlike biological evolution, where you cannot rewind the clock, there is no way for anybody to figure out just by looking at human beings as to what kind of species that they may have evolved from, because the nature of biological evolution is very spontaneous and random, right? And so the only way that we have come to know about evolution is through fossils. However, physical evolution, the evolution of the physical universe, is very different. The physical evolution takes place through physical equations of physics, the laws of physics, and all those laws are time reversible, which means that I can invert time and those laws will still hold. So if I'm in a certain situation, I can actually work backwards to see where that situation came from. And that's exactly what folks did to try to figure out if they could come up with stronger evidence that would prove the Big Bang theory. So let me explain this diagram in case some people are not familiar with it. It's one that you may have seen a lot. It's used everywhere. So the funnel is called the funnel diagram. So what we have going from left to right is time. And what we have vertical is essentially the size of the universe. So the fact that these lines are inclined a little bit shows that the universe is expanding with time. And if you go back to the beginning, you see that the universe was much smaller until you get to what we sometimes call the Big Bang. So now what you can do is you can start with the galaxies and you can start contracting the universe instead of expanding it. So basically, we are working backwards to see where the universe came from. If you do that, the first thing that you notice is that as you contract the universe, it gets hotter. Its temperature rises, just based on the physics of the situation. And so as these galaxies come closer and closer, they become into one big mass of mostly hydrogen gas with a little bit of helium in it as well. So now what happens if you keep contracting this gas, it becomes hotter until the atoms start to break up. The electrons in the atoms are separated from the nucleus of the atom. Now, physics tells us that once you separate the electrons from the nuclei, they become charged particles and they become opaque to light. So now working backwards, you can see that if our universe was opaque, there must have been a time when it suddenly became transparent when the atoms were formed. And at that time, all of the light would be released and it would start traveling through the universe. So when people figured this out, they made a prediction. They said that that light, which was released, and they could work out exactly how long it was released. It was in fact 300,000 years after the Big Bang. At that point, that light should still be around, and it should still be something that we can receive with our antennas. Now, it turns out that because of the expansion, the wavelength of the light expands, and so what is visible light becomes microwaves. So what they would have to look for was microwave radiation in the sky. And indeed, they did that, and they found it, though in this particular case, the discovery was accidental. This is the picture of the antenna. That's only a few miles from my house. It's in New Jersey. And it belonged to Bell Labs, which is the company I used to work for as well. And two scientists, two physicists, were looking for some other effects from the universe, and they kept coming up with this noise, and finally found out that that noise was nothing but the radiation left over from the Big Bang. And so this was the point in 1965 when more people started to believe in the Big Bang theory, because the evidence was almost, something that was incontrovertible at this point. There was no other mechanism that could generate the kind of light that they were seeing at that point. So by the way, I take a lot of my students here every year to show them the Big Bang. So it's nice to have this historical site so close to where I live. All right, so here is a picture also that many of you may have seen. It's called the cosmic microwave background radiation picture. Many people call it the baby picture of the universe. And you can see why, because 300,000 years compared to 14 billion years is like a couple of days in the life of a human being. So that's when our universe was 2 days old. And what we can look at is now exactly what the universe looked like at that point. So the darker areas in this picture tell you where there was more density, where there was more gas, and the lighter ones tell you where there was less gas. And it turns out that the temperature of the radiation goes along with that density as well. So this information has given us tremendous clues and ideas as to exactly how the universe came into being. But at the same time, it has also created a puzzle whose solution led to the answer that I'm going to talk about in terms of what happened before the Big Bang. So what was that problem? The problem was that this radiation is too uniform. So these little pock marks that you see on the diagram are actually very tiny variations, 1 in 10,000. If you don't go to that accuracy, then all that you see is one, sort of a merged picture, all uniform picture. Now, why was this a puzzle? The reason it was a puzzle is for the universe to become so uniform, all of the points within the universe have to be able to communicate with each other. That's how things thermalize, through this communication. And the fastest that this communication can take place is at the speed of light. But if the universe is as big as it is, then there is not enough time for the light to get from one side of the universe to the other side of the universe. And therefore, the universe should never be able to thermalize. And you can say, well, I can keep going further and further back when the universe was much smaller. But if you go further back, then you also have less time for the light to go from one side to the other. So no matter how far back you go, you can never show that this radiation should be so uniform. So this was a big dilemma and a big puzzle. And we'll see how that gets resolved. By the way, the picture in the middle here is my little grandson. So I got an excuse to put his picture in there. All right, so what happens now is we keep doing the same thing that we have been doing before. We keep contracting the universe to see what happens. So first you get the atoms to break up, and then what happens is that the nucleus inside the atoms also start to break up at a certain temperature. That's a much, much higher temperature, and it's much closer to the Big Bang. It's actually in the space of about 3 minutes after the Big Bang. But from this, what you can do is you can actually show as to what kind of nuclei would have formed during this phase. And by doing that, you can actually tell the elemental abundance of the universe to a very high accuracy. What you see on this picture, if you look at in the middle there, is that you can predict that the hydrogen in the universe should be about 76%, helium should be about 24%, and there should be a tiny, tiny, tiny bit of lithium. And guess what? People looked at the galaxies in the universe, and this was the exact composition that they found. So this was a tremendous proof that there was absolutely no question that this is how our universe had started. Now you can keep going further back. There's nothing to stop us because our equations can still be reversed in time. So when you do that, what you find is that even the protons and neutrons inside the nucleus, which is what the nucleus is made up of, will then start to fragment at this tremendous heat. And what gets turned out when they fragment is quarks. And these quarks are the most elementary particles along with the electrons. So no matter how much you heat them up, you're not going to get them to split any further. So what happens if we keep contracting the universe and therefore we keep heating the universe? Well, what happens is that these matter particles start to create antimatter particles. So before you know it, as you keep heating the universe, you get a huge number of matter and antimatter particles. And the tiny difference between the amount of matter and antimatter now becomes negligible. You have 10 billion times more matter and antimatter than you have matter that cannot be paired with an antimatter. So therefore, something very interesting happens here. The history before all of this contraction that I was explaining to you is now irrelevant, because the matter and antimatter is all that there is in the universe. And that is what decides what's going to happen next if we keep contracting and heating up the universe. And indeed, what we find is that if we keep increasing the temperature, the antimatter and the matter particles create this boiling soup where annihilation and creation is going on all the time, and they're kept in balance. So what exists at this stage is now only governed by the laws of nature, nothing else. It doesn't matter where you started from. And these laws of nature can be studied in our labs. So the further progress in what created the universe can now be done here on the Earth by simply colliding particles together. That's exactly what happens in particle colliders and accelerators, where you create artificially a temperature as high as 1 billion degrees because of the energy that you have in these particles. And by the way, energy and temperature are the same thing. That's what we know from physics. So by creating such high energies, we can actually study what happened in the Big Bang, or what happened to the universe when it was smaller and smaller and smaller. And here I'm going to introduce you to an acronym, which I'll be using later on. And when I talk about the laws of physics, a good way to talk about them is the organizing principle of the universe. So this is the organizing principle of the universe, and I'm going to call it opportu. Okay, so from now on, it is opportu that drives cosmic evolution, nothing else. Now we can study opportu, and we have been trying to assemble the parts of opportu in our labs for the last, so many decades, and we have made huge progress. We now know that in this opportu, this set of laws of physics, there are 4 fundamental forces. So you can split the opportu into these 4 laws, 1 law for each fundamental force. Now, don't worry about what these forces are. You don't need to care too much about it. But these are the names. They are called electromagnetism, which is related to electricity. Then there's a weak and a strong. These have to do with nuclear forces. We don't generally come across them. And then, of course, there's gravity, which everybody knows about. So these are the 4 forces of nature that we find in opportu. So now let's get closer and closer to the beginning of the universe. So again, this diagram is now only the small part that is towards the beginning. That's the only part that I'm looking at right now. So if you keep heating up, and we can study this in our lab now, particles actually become radiation. So it turns out that quantum theory tells us that particles are not hard and fast, small little balls. They're actually frozen energy. That's all there is. And if you keep heating it up, that energy dissolves, and what you get is just radiation. And of course, you get 1 radiation for every force. So you get 4 different types of radiation. So now what you have in the universe is light, nothing but light, 4 different kinds of light. So you can think of it as the verse from the Bible. God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Well, this was the point when light entered our universe. Now something very interesting starts to happen. And again, a lot of this is from studying stuff in our labs, but some of it, as you will see, is beyond the capability of our lab. So we are going to sort of make a little bit of a transition to something that is very well understood and to something that is now going to be a slightly more speculative, but still based on very, very strong, fundamental, solid physics. So as the universe gets hotter and hotter, all of these different forces start to merge with each other. We call this unification in physics. And they happen one by one. First, the electromagnetic and the weak force unite with each other. Then that united force unites with a strong force, and that unification is called the grand unification. And finally, all forces unite together, including gravity, right? So there are three phases of unification: first, second, and third. The first unification is something that we can very easily reproduce in our labs, and we understand it very well. We know all the equations of it. The second unification requires energy that is not feasible for us to create in our labs right now. Our governments can't even give us the kind of money that we would need to create a lab that can have that kind of energy. So this is where we now start to rely a little bit more on our equations to tell us what's going on. And the equations tell us that this particular unification will happen, the second unification. And something very interesting happens during this unification. In the first unification, all mass disappears. So everything that we think of as mass doesn't exist anymore after the first unification. In the second unification, energy disappears. But it doesn't disappear completely. It disappears into space. So it kind of merges into space. And that creates a very interesting thing. And this was discovered in 1980 by a guy called Alan Guth, an American physicist, who found that during this time, when energy disappears into space, he was able to then sort of look backwards and see what would happen if the universe was expanding. And what he found was that the universe, the energy getting into space, the fabric of space, makes the universe expand like crazy. It expands a trillion times its size in a trillionth of a second. And that is what he called inflation. And now we think of inflation as the Big Bang. So basically, when the Big Bang theory was invented, nobody really knew what exactly was the Big Bang. But now we have a clear idea of what the Big Bang is. It is the time of inflation. It is the time when the universe goes so quickly that you can't even keep track of how quickly it's going. Not only does it do that, but it is during this time that the energy within the universe expands to the point where it can now account for every single particle that we have in every single galaxy, in every single star, in every single planet. All of that mass and energy was created in that moment of inflation, which is pretty mind-boggling, but that's what our physics tells us. So this final unifications, the third unification is what I'm talking about. That involves study of quantum theory. And we understand quantum theory fairly well at this point, quite well, I would say. In fact, some people claim that it is the best understood theory in the world. It has been tested to 12 decimal places, which is incredibly amazing. So this theory tells us that there's a new phenomena that can take place, which is called quantum tunneling. And it is through this quantum tunneling that the final unification happens. So what we end up, once gravity is gone, gravity is tied into space and time. So when gravity disappears, then space and time disappear, and you're left with nothing. But not quite nothing, because you still have opportu. You still have the laws of physics. You still have the principles. Now, there are some physicists that try to show that you don't even need that the process of quantum tunneling can actually produce the laws of physics. And in fact, you can produce many different laws of physics, and each law of physics will be related to a different universe, and hence the multiverse theory. But what they forget is that you have to have a starting point. You have to have some principle. You can call it the quantum principle, whatever you want, because if you don't have any principle at all, then you cannot predict what will happen. The only way that science has of predicting what will happen is through some kind of a principle. So you're stuck with it. You can't get rid of that original opportu principle. That has to be there. And that's an important thing that we basically are concluding at this point. All right, so this is kind of the story. This is the human story that I was talking about. And as you can see, it's intertwined with our 14 billion year story. What I'm going to tell you now are some very high level conclusions of quantum theory. Now, these are going to be hard to comprehend because I'm going to tell them to you in like 2 minutes of time. And so don't worry, at least you'll get a broad picture of what I'm talking about. This, by the way, is what I'm planning to go much deeper into in my quantum theory course or quantum wisdom course in August. So if anybody's interested, let me know. And I think there is a link in the chat, if anybody's interested in doing that. But in that course, I would go into all of the depth and the details of it. But here it's important to just get a few facts straight. So let me talk about that. So what exactly is this opportu principle that we're talking about? Clearly, you can't think of it as being in space because there is no space. Space comes out of it. You can't think of it in any kind of a time frame because time is something that it produces. There's no time here, so it's a timeless thing. And as you will see, it can't even be caused because of what we know from quantum theory. So what is opportu? Opportu is the governing principle that holds in it, and this is important. This is something that comes from quantum theory. It holds in it unrealized possibility. Now, possibility doesn't look like a scientific term. You think about possibility as something that you imagine that you think about. It's not real. You can't hold possibility. However, what is real has to be redefined when you study science. What we think of real is something that is available to our senses, and our senses are very limited. So when you want to think about what is real in physics, you have to think of it more broadly. And the way that we think of it broadly is that if there is an equation that you can write, if there is a mathematical expression that you can create that can predict what will happen to this entity that you're trying to describe, and if you can verify that in your lab, then that stuff is real. It doesn't matter whether it appears real to you or not, it is real. And what quantum theory has done for us is that it has given us a way to mathematically understand the idea of possibility. We can write equations on possibility, and we can figure out exactly what those equations will do, and we have tested them thoroughly in our labs and so forth. So figuring out what this principle is now the holy grail of physics now. That's what we need to do. We've gotten quite far. We have a pretty good idea of what opportu is. We're just missing a few links here and there. And that is what a lot of the research that is going on right now is to figure out and to complete our understanding of opportu, which is what created our universe. So you can think of it as God if you want to. Well, what is physical reality? What does quantum theory have to say about physical reality? And again, I'm going to be very brief in these things. So all physical reality can be understood as the continuous realization of possibility. That's what our reality is. It's possibility that is transforming in front of us, and the transformation of that possibility is something that our senses are sensitive to, and that's what reality is basically. And so this set of unrealized possibility is what physicists call quantum field. I mean, I'm sure you've heard about that term too, but that's basically what it is. It's the set of unrealized possibilities. And so you're already starting to see now that the duality between matter and spirit is really falling apart. I mean, there is no matter at all. We are starting now with something as non-material as possibility, right? That's the starting point. So then what is quantum reality? So realized possibilities is what are available to our senses, but there's also unrealized possibility all the time. That is where realized possibility comes from. And this storage or scope of unrealized possibility is what we call quantum reality or hidden reality. It's very interesting that a lot of mysticism revolves around the existence of this kind of a hidden reality, and it is something that is, at least from this perspective, quantum theory has a pretty good handle on. In fact, I won't go into the depth of this as well, but there's a very interesting piece of research done in the last few decades that shows that the mass of every object, only 5% of the mass of every object comes from realized possibilities. The 95% of the mass, including our own mass, comes from unrealized possibilities, which are in this hidden part of reality. So what about causality? I said that, causality gets a very different viewpoint in quantum theory. So really, in the causality as we know it today has no meaning in quantum, at the quantum level. Events don't happen because of causes at all. Events are basically happening because there is a possibilities that is inviting them to happen. It's a very different view of causality that emerges from quantum theory. And so that's, again, it's something that one can go much deeper into. So what exactly is energy? Because everything comes from energy, even mass comes from energy, and that's what Einstein told us. So it turns out that energy is something that is contained in unrealized possibilities. So we mathematically can calculate the amount of energy that there is in any set of unrealized possibilities. So if you give me a quantum field, I can tell you how much energy it has. And you can show that all the energy that we have in the universe eventually comes from the fluctuations. And let me show you exactly what the fluctuations in unrealized possibility look like. So this is a little bit of an artist view, but it's also based on certain calculations. In fact, these were the calculations that showed that 95% of our own mass is coming from these state of unrealized possibility that's inside each atom that makes up our bodies. So more things like that, I'm just going to go through quickly. What is force? So force is an important thing, and sometimes I refer to that as affinity. So an existing state shows varying affinity towards possibilities. So we have a world of possibilities, and wherever our starting point is, it has a certain affinity towards these possibilities. The one that it has the most affinity for is the one that is most likely to get realized, right? Other possibilities can get realized as well, but affinity decides which possibility has the highest chance of getting realized. And then finally, I talk about the evolution of affinity, which is an important thing as well. So the evolution of affinity is a very interesting thing that one can think about. And we all know about the evolution of form. We all know about the evolution, of physical matter. That's how we came here, was through the evolution of physical matter. But you can also look to see how affinity evolves, how forces evolve. And so in the beginning, there are forces of gravity, there are forces of electromagnetism, and so forth. But as you see how evolution is taking place, those forces take on very different forms. For example, in biological evolution, what is it that brings molecules together to make cells? What is it that brings cells together to build organisms? What is it that brings organisms together to create communities? These are forces, and these are nothing but the evolution of the fundamental forces. Just like form evolves, the forces are evolving as well. And so you can conclude that some of the affinity that we feel, why are we so attracted to spiritual things? What is it? It can be traced to an affinity as well. There's some kind of an affinity that we have that makes us want to look at these kinds of things, right? So I'm not even going to read these things all through, but these are some parallels that I've drawn between what I've just told you from quantum theory and with mysticism. I apologize for the small font here, but Hindu mythology, for example, talks about Brahma. Brahma is really kind of the equivalent of God in other religions. And it talks about how this ultimate reality is incomprehensible, unlimited, unthinkable. And not only is it that, but Hindu mythology considers the universe to have been not so much created, but actually morphed from Brahma. So Brahma doesn't create the universe. Brahma actually turns into the universe, which is, to me, very much like, thinking about that fundamental principle that we talked about. The principle gives rise to the universe simply by becoming realized possibility from unrealized possibility. Buddhism has some very similar kinds of things. Even when you look at Christianity, you can look at some ideas that seem to be very plausible here in terms of comparison. We talked about the fall from perfection. We started with a perfect universe with full symmetry, everything, and then those symmetries started to fall back. I didn't talk a whole lot about symmetries, but when those forces start to unify with each other, basically what's happening is that you're gaining more and more symmetry until at the end, when you go to the opportu aspect, you have perfect symmetry. And so basically how the universe started is by falling from that perfection. So, one can think in those terms. Okay, I'm moving towards the end of my presentation, and I'm going to end with, what Noel said. I'll actually read out some poetry that I've tried to put together. But here in these last few things, I'm going to talk a little bit about my views now. It's not so much science anymore. It's my views of convergence between science and spirituality, which is what I have gleaned from a lot of these things that I've been talking to you about. So here's what I think about scientists and theologians at this point in time. So I think that not all scientists, but there's a whole lot of rather zealous scientists that believe that we understand creation so well that there is no need for any kind of a spirit or a miracle or any of those sorts of things. And I think that there is a point beyond which you can't really take science. That's at least what quantum theory tells us. On the other hand, there's also theologians that believe that science is constantly in denial of spirituality, which is partly true. But now we are seeing that so much of what science is uncovering has such an incredible parallelism to what we always thought about as spirituality. So this is my view now. Both sides are trying to resolve a mystery, right? There is a mystery at the heart of our cosmos. And the real value of that mystery is not in its resolution. In fact, I wonder if there will ever be a resolution, but the real value lies in experiencing that mystery and getting inspiration from it. And that's, I think, what we should really focus on. So what science has succeeded in doing is to reframe the questions that we asked in the beginning. And it has also deepened and intensified the impact of some of the answers that we've gotten with all the amazing truths that have been revealed. And all of that has been done with our scientific method, the evidence-based approach. On the other hand, religion has added a lot of value as well. Religion has actually shown us how to internally connect with those truths that quantum theory is now revealing to us. Because remember, those truths are not just out there in physics. Those truths are what we came out of. So they are part of us. In fact, you can even show that all of what happened in the Big Bang is in a sense happening all the time. That's how reality is being created, not just at the Big Bang, but it's being created every moment of time, from unrealized possibility to realized possibility. So it's all here. It's not even 14 billion years ago. Now, the same truth that our intuition has access to because of the 14, and this is what I was talking about, that connects it to the original affinity in the organized principle, is now being revealed to our rational mind using an evidence-based approach. So this would explain why people 2,000 years ago, when they did not have any science, they could still feel some of these things that they tried to give words to, which is very difficult. So it's not surprising that mystical ideas that arose during the development of religion spiritually all across the world over the last 2,000 years have such amazing parallels, right? That's what I just said. So here's the bottom line, right? Neither of our two stories has a conclusion right now. We're in the middle of that story. But it does make you wonder if the curiosity that we humans have, which grew naturally in us through the process of evolution, right? If that curiosity is actually the benefit, that there is a benefit that that curiosity is going to bring by once again helping us come together. Remember, affinity is one of those things whose evolution constantly tries to bring us together, from cells to organisms to communities. And now perhaps this is a new kind of affinity that is being created, which is helping, I hope, will help us come together again, right? That's, of course, my optimism. So my last slide here, the two stories will now merge into one. It is the same story. In fact, what I told you, the second story that I told you, is just the last chapter of, I should say, the latest chapter. We don't know what the last chapter is. It is the latest chapter of the long story. And here I say that we've come to a beautiful question. Remember, I said that questions are more important than answers. We've come to a beautiful question, and David Whyte, who's an Irish poet, he calls them damn beautiful questions. We have come up to a damn beautiful question to ponder on and to stay in the presence of. And that is the question about the connection between spirituality and science. And, this is basically where I'm going to end. Let me stop sharing my screen. So before I open it up to Q&A, Noel, is it okay if I now just turn on the video for my for that poetry?
Absolutely.
All right. All right.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. So just to tell you, this is something I'm not a poet. I don't write poetry at all, but just a few weeks ago, some project that I was undertaking as part of my deep time involvement in the deep time organization kind of pushed me to do something different, to actually, express the story in some kind of a different way. And so I ended up putting this together, and I've added some images to it as well. And you will see that what you will hear is basically a retelling of the story that I just told you. But in a slightly different way. Okay, so here goes.
Can you feel the love tonight? The untold part of our origin story. This is a story about how the story began. It is about what happened before the bang, before the fireball, before the flaring forth, before the great expansion that became our universe. There was at first no space, not even any time. There was no physicality. It was a world sublime. Within the abstraction, there lay a rich perfection. All the fundamental forces were in deep connection. It was a kind of nothingness, the ground of all being, a sort of empty fullness with nothing there but dreams. The dreams are all possibilities of what it can become. They cover all the likelihoods of what is yet to come. The possibilities come and go, dancing in and out, moving faster than light. They're impossible to count. The spirit that seems to move them so is restless as a child's. Its nature is to seek and explore with a disposition that's wild. These unstoppable agitations are called quantum fluctuations. They come in all shapes and sizes, and they have no limitations. Cause and effect, and Newton's laws, for them have no meaning. Beyond the reach of space and time, for them there is no ceiling. This constant hum, does anyone know whence it doth come? To Hindus a sound of Om, to physicists a quantum vacuum. A wholesome unity, a singular oneness, and a perfect symmetry. For us worldly humans, this spirited abstraction is a total mystery. And then it happened. The spirit, while exploring, saw a dream that was so awe-inspiring. It was wild and ambitious and very alluring. The spirit was in love. Its heart was soaring. The dream was brilliant, dazzling, and so much more. It was beautiful, captivating, something to die for. There was love, there was passion, and a burning fire. What was this dream that evoked so much desire? It was flowering fields under clouds so high, snow-capped mountains against bright blue skies. Vast grassy meadows dotted with sheep, gentle rivers flowing into oceans deep. It was thick green forests laced with blue streams, speckled butterflies hovering in sun's shiny gleam, and a humming, buzzing world full of human beings, braving their imperfections and living their dreams. This amazing dream, it must be achieved at all costs. It was worth every risk and peril that lay on its path. It'd be a long journey with no chance of coming back. Once begun, it must be followed to the end of the track. Spirit leaped into the unknown, and onward it went, breaking all its peaceful symmetry for a risky event. Driven by a fiery passion that stirred within, it was prepared to take all chances that lay therein. Creating space and time was as easy as pie, but filling it with matter, the difficulty was high. Empty space can naturally grow and expand. To fill it with butterflies, we need something grand. It was then that another fluctuation brought a vision forth. Pour as much energy into space as its emptiness can afford. It meant breaking another symmetry that had long endured. But if the result was flowers and zebras, then spirit was lured. Energy fluctuations in empty space had already borne some fruit, but the particles were virtual. Of that there was no dispute. For matter to emerge, physicality must take birth. Particles must become real to build heaven and earth. It had to happen. Another quantum leap was provoked. The energy spread so rapidly that inflation was invoked. The universe swelled 1,000,000,000,000 times and another 1,000,000,000,000-fold. It all happened in the split of a second, too small to behold. Flaring forth it was, but some called it Big Bang. It was the tiny fireball from which our universe sprang. Every particle in the dream was where it needed to be. With some unfolding, it would turn into star and galaxy. 14 billion years it took to make the dream come true. The fiery love that brought it forth is inside me and you. To see the love, you must connect with the spirit deep inside. Try it now and tell me, dear, if you can feel the love tonight. The restlessness is still all there. The dream is yet alive. This is just a resting place beyond which it needs to thrive. Love that sprang in a quantum field is now for us to ride. So move the spirit forward, dear. Take the next big stride. Thank you.
That's it, folks.
Wonderful,
Wow.
wonderful. I'm putting everything in the gallery view. Please turn on your video. Let's give some love to Sarbmeet. That's
Thank you. Thank you.
just, wow. Viola, do you want to unmute, or we do have a few questions?
Okay, there's questions in the chat.
Yes, we have someone who has asked, what are multiverses then? How does this come about if indeed this theory is correct?
Okay, the multiverse theory is very speculative. The problem with the multiverse theory is that those who propose the theory have not yet been able to tell us any way in which the theory can be verified or tested. So I suspect that this is something that's going to remain in that space of speculation for a long time. So if multiverses exist, then they are essentially universes with a different set of laws from the ones that we have. And we can show that most of those universes would never be able to support life. You know, if you look at all the possible universes that you can create out of all the different laws that you can write, 1/1,000,000,000 of a trillionth of them have the right characteristics to support life. And one of the amazing things about the story of our universe is that the universe that God created happened to be the one in which life could develop and thrive. And to me, that in itself is a mystery, a very, very deep mystery.
I see a question from Rashir. Pardon me if I mispronounced your name.
Nickel,
Yeah. Why does tribalism survive in the age of rationality?
Ooh, deep question. All I can say to that question is that rationality was never intended to be and never is the solution to the prosperity of our journey, if I may say that. Rationality is an important component. Without that, we wouldn't have all the science that I just talked about. But if you rely only on rationality, I don't think we're going to get very far. I'll just say that.
I see here, Viola, let me help you. Marinelle, I'm sorry if I'm not mispronouncing this. Would you please go over expansion of space, the raisin cake?
Yes, I'd be happy to do that. So the important thing to understand about expansion is that it is caused by more space being created between two things. So if I have two objects, there are two ways in which I can move them further apart from each other. One is that I can take a hold of them or apply a force on them and actually push them apart. In that case, those objects will be moving in space. That's not expansion. Expansion means that I don't move those objects at all, but I actually create more space between them. And because of the creation of more space, they would automatically move apart. And that's exactly what happens in a raisin cake. Nobody pushes those raisins apart other than the fact that there is more batter that gets added between them. I hope that's helpful. That's, I guess, the best I can do here.
Well, Noel, you and Bob had some questions earlier on. Did he answer your questions?
Well, those were just the kind of like hypothetical questions he was asking, but we have some others like, why did it happen 14 billion years back?
That's an interesting question. So there's no answer to that other than the fact that when we look at where we are today and we use our knowledge of science to figure out how long it would have taken for the natural processes that got us here, and we understand them quite well now, that it would actually have to take that much time for us to be here. There isn't really any shortcut. There had to be a time during which the gas in our universe would slowly aggregate in a way that would help us create stars and galaxies. That can take 1 billion years or so. And then there would have to be enough time for those stars to die and create the elements that are needed for life and do it again and again until there was enough concentration that we could actually make planets out of them. And then those planets had to be around for enough time for molecules to become cells, for cells to become organisms, for organisms to become human beings. If you add all that time, it comes to 14 billion years. So give or take. That's why it's 14 billion years.
Okay, Carl asked a question. What are your thoughts if we take consciousness as the fundamental principle of the universe rather than matter?
I don't have any strong thoughts on that. I know that that is a theory that is talked about quite a bit in, especially during these current discussions that I've heard about. A lot of people say that we need to start with consciousness in order to justify the way that the universe is and has evolved. From my study, from my understanding of quantum theory, I do not perceive an absolute need for that. But that doesn't mean that that's a wrong idea. When we start talking about these kinds of things, we are in a very speculative arena. Science doesn't have any tools to tell us who is right or who is wrong in this kind of a thing. I hope that makes sense.
Oh, very interesting questions coming up here. Ronnie wants to know that does opportu have intelligence?
Mm-hmm. Now, that's a little bit of a loaded question as well, because one has to first define what intelligence is. Here's my take on it. It is opportu that ended up getting us to where we are. I mean, literally, that is our starting point. Give me an opportu, and I will give you this universe that we are in today. If that is not intelligence, then I don't know what the definition of intelligence is. So, it's really up to you.
Okay, someone sent me a direct message, but it was meant for you. This was from Joseph, sorry. You said that the four fundamental forces are light. Then how could they exist before light was generated?
Okay, thank you. The four fundamental forces are not light. Maybe that was a miscommunication or a misunderstanding. The four fundamental forces are simply four kinds of ways in which the particles that were created as a result of evolution, basically, there are four different ways in which those particles can interact with each other. They can pull on each other, if you want to say that. So gravity being one of them, electromagnetism being another, and there's two other ones. Those four forces, if you heat up the universe enough, which means if you contract it to a smaller and smaller universe, eventually dissolves into what you can think of as light. And each force comes up with its own light. It's the light that comes from electromagnetic force is the one that we see with on a day-to-day basis. The one that exists in our everyday world is the light that is associated with electromagnetic, one of the four forces. The light from the other forces, it's not visible to us, but it is there, it's operating. It's the reason why atoms can hang together the way they do. But it's not something that is sensitive. Our eyes are not sensitive to those other lights. So the lights and the forces are two different things. They're not the same thing.
Okay.
I just want to jump in here. We had a comment for Ambi. Said, wonderful experience, Sarbmeet. Deep gratitude to you. Thanks to the presence of all attendees. And
oh, wonderful.
Yes, there's wonderful feedback here. And do you have one there, Viola? If you don't, I do.
Well, I have a real short one.
All right.
It says, what is this space? It's from Marinel. What is the space?
What is the space? Ooh, so from a scientific point of view, space is a quantum field. It is a quantum field that is associated with the force of gravity, as it turns out. Now, that's the scientific way to look at it. On a day-to-day basis, we all know what space is. It's the part of our environment where we cannot detect any kind of matter. So, for example, what we see as emptiness is often not emptiness because there is air in it. But if we suck the air out, and if we suck every other thing that we know of that is in that air out, then what is left is space. So space, in a sense, is nothingness. But of course, Einstein showed us that it's far from the kind of nothingness that we usually think about, because it can do all kinds of things, not only expand, but do all sorts of other things as well. I hope that helps. Yeah.
As a follow-up to my question about light, if shouldn't your discussion be, instead of what happened before the Big Bang, should it be what happened before light?
Can you feel the love tonight?
Joe, can you repeat that one more time? I couldn't
sorry.
hear it. Yeah, go ahead, please.
Sorry. Should the discussion of this conversation be, instead of what happened before the Big Bang, should it be what happened before light exists?
Oh, okay, got it. I got the question. So that all depends on how we define the Big Bang. When the Big Bang theory was created, nobody said exactly what the Big Bang was. It was a name given to the whole theory. That's it. Like, you couldn't define. Some people thought it was the moment at which the beginning, the real beginning, that was the Big Bang. Other people thought it was the whole expansion of the universe was the Big Bang. So only now, in the last few decades, we've been able to more clearly say what we mean by Big Bang. And there is general agreement among physicists that the best part of the evolution story that deserves the label Big Bang is the inflation, because that is when the universe expanded so rapidly, very, very quickly. So it makes sense for us to call that the Big Bang. And then you can now talk about what happened before the Big Bang. And we know that before inflation, there were other unifications that basically got broken, right? In the beginning, we had complete symmetry. Then we got one symmetry broken and space and time was created. Then we got a second symmetry broken, and that created all the other forces. And we think that it's during this breakage of symmetry that inflation happened. But this is not certain. This is still a little bit speculative. What people do believe is that inflation did happen, because there is tremendous evidence for that. And there are many things about the theory that cannot be explained without inflation. So people believe that inflation happened. Exactly what it was that made that inflation happen is still some matter of debate. But the most probable scenario looks like that second unification phase that happened. So that's the Big Bang.
Is it nonsensical then to ask what happened before space-time?
No, it's not nonsensical. In fact, basically, according to my story that I told you, before space-time was nothing but the governing principle, the opportu that I called opportu. That was there before there was space and time. So we do have an idea about what was there before space and time. And we kind of know as to how space and time got created from that principle. We can work all of that stuff out in physics, which is amazing to me.
Can I ask a question with my hands? Yeah.
Yes, Pat, go ahead.
How did opportu came about? And also, we're not talking about the singularity anymore at the beginning.
Yeah. So first, let me ask you this. Let me answer the second question. We don't call it a singularity because when we apply quantum theory to the Big Bang theory, there is no singularity left, right? So we now don't talk about singularities anymore. Now, your other question was, how did the opportu come to be? Is that what your question was?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So
we
that
say
is
it's there, but just
yeah. So that is what I refer to as the central mystery of our universe. Okay. And the reason I say that is because science certainly cannot answer that question. because the only way that science can answer a question is to use a principle, a law, an equation, a mathematical thing, in order to tell us what would happen. That's the only thing that science is able to do. That's a limitation of science, if you want to call it that. So if you don't have a principle, then what can science do? Science cannot tell you anything. So science cannot tell you where opportu came from. Maybe some other institution can, maybe religion can, I don't know. But science certainly at that point has to stop. You know, there is no way for us to figure out where the principles come from, or at least one of the principles comes from. You can maybe even, if you have one principle, you might be able to generate the other principles from it, but you have to start somewhere. And that is the single principle. Okay, I hope that
Thank you.
helps.
Rashir wants to know, what is a good book to read on this?
Okay, the best book that I can suggest is a book by Larry Krauss. He's an astrophysicist. And the title of the book is A Universe from Nothing. That's definitely one of the places that I learned a lot of my knowledge from. And it is written at a layman's level, so most folks should be able to grasp at least a decent amount of that book. I have to warn you a little bit, though. Larry Krauss is one of those zealous physicists, and at some places in the book, it seems like his only purpose is to disprove the existence of God, or to basically debate all these theologians. So, there is a little bit of that, but his physics is very sound, and he does a good job with it.
Okay. Ashok would like to know, could our universe contract back into nothingness? If not, what would prevent that from occurring?
Okay. So the answer is yes. There is no theoretical reason why that cannot happen. So far from what we know about our universe, it doesn't look like we are on our way to a contraction. Because up until about 20 years ago, people thought that the expansion of our universe was slowing down, which made a lot of sense because gravity slows down expansion, and there's a lot of gravity in our universe. About 20 years ago, it's almost 30 now, I think, well, 25, we found out that the opposite is true. The expansion is not slowing down, the expansion is actually accelerating. And this is the source of what we now call dark energy. I did not talk about dark matter and dark energy, that's a whole another subject. But we now, so far, it looks as if our universe is never going to contract because it's actually expanding faster and faster. Who knows? We could come up with another discovery later on that shows us that this acceleration is temporary and that at some point the acceleration will stop. But at this point, we have no way to know. All right.
I want to jump in with just some other comments here. Pradeep says, thank you very much. Sarbmeet, excellent presentation. And Alicia says, the poetic description was beautiful. I don't think I'll ever look at the sky in the same way again.
Oh, thank you.
That is something.
And Ronnie suggested that you add physicist poet to your resume.
Thank you very much.
And text says, brilliant, Sarbmeet. I'll have to review a few times this rather dense, light-filled presentation. My curiosity is definitely ignited. Big bang there, Tex. But there is another question from Carl. What are your thoughts if we take consciousness as a fundamental principle of the universe rather than matter?
Okay, I think I may have answered that question earlier. I don't have a lot of thoughts on that. I think that that's a possible starting point, but being at heart a scientist, which is what I am, I would want some more evidence. to show me that that consciousness is indeed a fundamental property of our universe. But who knows? Maybe that's true. By the way, before we stop, I really want to compliment the whole audience here for certainly listening to my talk very well, because otherwise you wouldn't be able to ask me these questions. But also I want to compliment everybody for really a wonderful set of questions. I mean, you guys really made me think. So very, very good questions there.
Well, I'm sure there are a whole lot more, but we do have to close. And I want to mention that we did put in the chat the link to take Sarbmeet's course. You want to talk a little bit about that and about the quantum wisdom course that you're offering, when that is? And
yes, thank you. So just a little plug for that here. The course is a 4-week course, and every week there would be 2 sessions, one on Wednesdays and one on Fridays. The Wednesday session is from 7 to 9 p.m. The Friday session is from 11 to 1 p.m. And they will be repeats. So the reason that why we have 2 sessions every week is to accommodate people from other time zones, other countries that may not be able to make it. And each session will be, as I said, 2 hours long. The course starts, I don't remember the exact date, but it's the 8th or the 9th of August, whatever the Wednesday is. And then it goes towards the end of August. So more information can be found on the website that Noel put out there. You can go there and check it out. All of those sessions will be recorded. So if you miss it, you can always listen to it again and again if you want. And the content of the course will be very much based on some of the ideas that I presented towards the end, which is, what quantum theory tells us about our reality, and about the context of the universe that we find ourselves living in, and what we can learn from that, that sort of thing, the wisdom part. All right.
just a few more things here. Olivia says, wonderfully creative with your poem and beautiful grandchild as the baby universe. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes.
Yes.
Yep.
And Tex is also reminding people about the deep time perspective. You can go to dtnetwork.org. And I think that's where a lot of you have met, if I'm correct. And I find it fascinating. I'm really grateful that Tex brought the deep time to the Co-Creators Convergence. We've had such wonderful, wonderful guests and conversations. So with that, I'm going to say good night, but I'm going to allow you to have the final word, Sarbmeet.
Oh, thank you. I just want to thank everybody for honoring the class and for what I had to say, and being such a wonderful audience. So I look forward to seeing at least some of you soon in other contexts and other courses. And I hope that you all enjoy your summer.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Viola, for bringing